Welcome to The Ground Truth. This is where Hugo and I get together once a month and we unpick what has happened in the last month across defense and national security, everything from Whitehall and policy to MOD's buying behavior and some of the patterns we're seeing and insights that we generate over the last month.
This month, for me, it was the blistering attack by Lord Robertson, who was the government's lead reviewer for its Strategic Defence Review published last year, on the performance of the entire political class in terms of the seriousness with which it's taking defence, but also the government's record in driving at increasing defence spending and also accelerating the adoption of the recommendations that he and his team made to the government. The frustration boiled over in Salisbury at this major address that he delivered on the 14th of April. I had the chance to be in that audience, and genuinely you could have heard a pin drop. And I think this has shown that the defence community has now decided to be very public about how it is that the government needs to improve its record in this, making off some serious trade-offs across other areas of public expenditure. You raised the need to move that spending from parts of the welfare budget into defence, for example, which is a very, very bold statement. So for me, this was the moment of the month, and it's really permeated across the whole system, and I think reflected a lot of views in the defence sector.
Yeah, and leader of the opposition, Kemi Badenoch, also made this argument when she gave her speech at the London Defence Conference. So we were both there. You and I see the world very differently, which is why not only is it so fun to work together, but also that we can come out with differing views on certain things. What was your view of the London Defence Conference? What was important?
Well, thanks. And look, this was mid-April. We were both there. We were both sort of moving around the corridors and sort of hearing different things. But for me, that it was a stark contrast between day one, where you had the Defence Secretary, John Healey, in a fireside chat with Ian Martin, who's the director for the London Defence Conference, an event that's been going on for 4 years now. And sort of upon questioning the Defence Secretary, expressing that he felt, in response to direct questioning, that the UK is actually ready for war. And I think this was a view that was not widely shared in the audience, and it was bit of a talking point that raised significant concern amongst the audience. But then, exactly as you say, we headed into day two, and you had not only the speech of His Majesty's opposition, as you say, with a very energetic and really a first major speech from Kemi Badenoch on sort of, as it were, defence policy under her watch of a prospective potential Conservative government, but also the Armed Forces Minister later in the day, Al Khan's MP, who gave himself quite an energetic, I felt, speech, maybe offering a bit of credibility back to the government. So this was not a case of it being a complete disaster for the government, but I think it was a talking point at the event that it was a sort of almost conference of two halves. Perhaps that complacency that Lord Robertson mentioned, that could have been a trigger for his intervention, quite frankly. But I think on day two, a lot more energy and acceptance across the piece as to the situation.
I was really struck at the LDC with the opening of the Secretary of Defense's speech and even kind of his physical body language. He was a little bit slumped over, felt like he was very low energy. And, it was really extraordinary. The comments, you and I were sitting next to each other, but the comments around us at the end of it, people muttering under their breath things like disgraceful, appalling, shocking, that he's saying that we are ready, yet we don't have a defense investment plan. We're ready. Is everything funded? So I think that there was a lot of dismay from the audience. What I took away from the LDC was I was very struck by our U.S. guests, so the congressional delegation, who had a very strong commitment to the UK and to Europe, saying that we are with you. But notably from Congressman out of North Carolina, saying that his opening speech of we are not ready, the US is not ready, the UK is not ready, but how do we work together? So something that I took away from all of the conversations with folks at the LDC over those 2 days is that the diplomacy is really happening at the corporate and the commercial level. Now that this is even more stark right now, given the political uncertainty in the UK, because we have to continue to spend in defense. We have to continue to acquire capabilities, and the pace and the threat is urgent. And so really what I see happening is the partnerships between SMEs and primes, between SMEs and SMEs, companies on their own, people driving funding into defense is really a demonstration that we don't really have strong leadership at the political level in defense. And so the leadership is now coming from industry. And those partnerships at that kind of operational level with program managers and contract officers, and people having the budget and authority for certain task forces or program budgets, that is actually where the diplomacy is happening. And that was the kind of key insight that I took away from the LDC. But kind of,
I think so much work has been going through industry and with industry to forge these almost diplomatic relations, as you've mentioned. This government has been sort of driving at a wide series of bilateral relationships with European partners and also the US as well. And industry is very prominent in that discussion. And I think that was reflected in the LDC. I think this government was struggling now and right now as we speak in terms of sort of a rebellion in the Labour Party, and the outcome of which is not yet clear. But I think this government under Healey, which is why I think so many people were almost disappointed, many were frustrated, some were angry, as you mentioned, is that I think under his watch, they have been trying to forge deeper relationships with different parts of industry. I think the issue now, though, as reflected in the conference and as reflected in the mood in Robertson, was that they just haven't been moving quick enough. The publication of the Defence Investment Plan, how it is that they sort of seek to integrate tech companies into the defence machinery, but also some of the appointments that we're still awaiting for, the long delayed appointment of the National Armaments Director, and we're still waiting for white smoke on others. So not to make this a complete whinge fest, but I think, the motivation of the government has been there to actually drive a deeper industrial cooperation. But
yeah.
as you say, it sort of bubbled over a little bit at the LDC in the context of broad acceptance in our community, I think, that,
Yeah.
that this has not been moving quick enough.
I think, too, I was really struck by a conversation I had yesterday where observations of we talk about defense in the UK, and I think maybe from a political leadership level is, oh, it takes a long time to turn a ship a few degrees. But we see our partners in Europe and also our allies in the US moving on a dime and willing to change the rules to spend money faster. So I think some of the pressure on the UK is, there is really no excuse for moving faster and being able to do things differently. And the manifestation of that, of, a recommendation that I think would be helpful is on your point about working with SMEs and industry, is not so much reaching a KPI of giving a certain percentage of funds to SMEs and to certain parts of industry, but what is the actual outcome that we are trying to achieve? So in terms of the strategic effect we're going to have, if we're working backwards from dominance, competitive advantage, being able to defend something larger than a small market town, which we've also heard from Lord Robertson in an engagement with the BBC, is, what is the outcome instead of if we spend 30% on SMEs, that's wonderful. But if we still can't fight and win wars, that's that's a vapor metric. So interesting kind of where the opportunities lie in some of these changes. So if we go back to, the kind of, we've captured the mood of the London Defense Conference, which I think had a lot of energy. Everyone, I think, is still very committed to defense and wants to make a difference. They just need they need some real leadership, some political leadership coming out. So going back to your Rosemont report, what are some of the kind of 2 to 3 key items that we can go over and talk about that you think are important?
Absolutely. Well, we certainly started on a slightly sober note. So just to elevate things, I would like to highlight the first state visit as monarch of His Majesty the King to the United States. And, this was a big moment for an attempt by the government to reset relationships, troubling relationships with the US administration. It has been choppy at times. And I think all things considered, we can sort of conclude up front that this was a very positive and successful state visit by His Majesty. And we see at the heart of his agenda in Washington with 2 major speeches, one to the joint meeting of the US Congress, one a rather jovial after dinner speech at a state banquet, that actually defense and national security policies were central to the narrative of the visit, with His Majesty noting and being applauded by some skeptics in Congress as to the importance of continuing to support Ukraine and its efforts against Russia, and the importance of that for European and wider allied security, but also with references to critical alliances and agreements, notably NATO, and
Mhm.
specifically AUKUS agreement. And, this is heralded as sort of mainstream and things that absolutely we should be doing in the US. But I think we need to be open and honest with ourselves. There have been doubts and questions about the US administration seriousness on some of this. So I really want to flag that up as one of our headline
Mm.
points from this month that is relevant for our sector and our industry, and flag up that this has been a useful reset. I don't think anybody's in denial that the current prime minister, for as long as he is prime minister, and the US president have had their ups and downs for sure. But I think we saw an exemplary visit, and of course some good humour on both sides. And for me, it sort of came to a head quite brilliantly when His Majesty is teasing the United States for it being, were it not for us, sort of the Americans would be speaking French, which for me is rather a reminder to us all as to the strength of this relationship. So that's my headline item for this month.
And that ties into another event that we both attended, which is something put on by our charity, the Common Mission Project, called the Red Queen, and where we gather senior folks from across the US, UK, NATO to have a conversation around some of the challenges we're facing. How do we build relationships and think differently? And the theme this year was really about how do we interact with companies, those budget holders and those in authority? How do we really have those fruitful conversations to buy capabilities that matter and that we know are going to solve problems, but do it in a way that can also drive private capital into the defense market? We can have different types of relationships and partnerships. And so kind
Yeah.
of picking up on, we had a really good contingent of UK folks. We had a really good contingent of NATO and a very strong contingent of kind of those budget holders and those that have authority in the US. And there was nothing but collaboration and excitement to work together. And so for me, kind of taking away what you talk about of the King's visit is we saw that on an operational level at the Red Queen. People who are actively learning from each other, who are actively building partnerships. And how do we kind of co-create together? How do we co-invest across the US and the UK? And then how do we learn together to be able to work with industry in similar ways? And that really struck me about our trip out to California. I don't know if you saw anything different, but I was so encouraged. There was so much energy on that lessons learned and working with industry. And then also, how do we, working on analogous problems, how do we then co-invest in capabilities? And that was a real theme that came out of the Red Queen a few weeks ago in California.
100%. And I would say that both Red Queen and His Majesty the King's intervention have shown that rumours that this special relationship is in
Mm.
trouble or has demised are grossly exaggerated. So I totally agree with that. And I think we have to cut through the noise of some of the political complexities, which do
Mm.
have an effect and do take their toll on the opportunity for operational collaboration. But I think we should be skeptical, particularly at the most senior operational levels of the military and across national security more broadly. And I think therein lies opportunity for companies, whilst acknowledging that these opportunities also exist across Europe as well. But I noticed you, Ali, sort of talking a little bit about how for you this was the best one yet. And I just
Mm.
wanted to take this opportunity to sort of ask you why that was really, because this event is quite a mainstream in terms of bringing Silicon Valley and innovators together at the senior operational level. But you've done a few of these now, and I wonder what led you to being so positive about this one in particular?
This year, why I think it worked really well is because we brought in people who are trying to actively solve the problem and have the budget and the authority to do so. And so, kind of one removed from that very high level, top down, setting the policy and the strategy to, okay, these are the people who are doing the work and they are solving the complex problems and they are coming up with innovative solutions and they're putting forward different policies and processes and even buying authorities to test something different. And I think that coupled then with interacting with industry and some of the best tech companies out there was really interesting because we do have a rhetoric in the UK around defense of we want to work with the best companies in the world. We need to engage with startups, scale ups, venture backed, private equity backed, companies, primes. We need to engage with the full gambit. I don't think we know what that actually means. And so we have things set up like the Office for Small Business Growth, which hasn't been around long enough for us to kind of make a determination or judgment on it. But I think that government and in particular defense has gotten the demand signal and is now responding to it. But I think there's still that gap of interaction, which is where Hugo, you and I play with the companies that we work with. There's still that gap between the good intention of the MOD and then industry. And so there's a bit of a language gap. There's an expectations gap. There's not often an alignment of incentives. The Red Queen brought that together where we put people face to face and said, okay, now interact and have those conversations. Okay, go back and then try again and ask different questions and kind of coaching both on the industry and the government side. For me, that was really powerful because it's not just enough to have a budget and go out there and say, okay, industry, we're open for business. There's so much that is left unsaid. And there's also a lot of incentives and demand signals that are not put out in some of these RFPs or RFIs or even ITTs. And so I think we cut through a lot of that noise at the Red Queen. And for me, that's what made it so powerful. And I think kind of set the bar for us going forward.
I think that's fascinating. I think that's extremely valuable. And I think the connection between the policy conversation and that senior operational interface between government and sort of military and security professionals and the industry, there's still that gap. As I mentioned earlier, the government is seeking to bring new entrants into the fold as part of that discussion. But the system still struggles, and you mentioned the Office for Small Business Growth, which is a welcome development, but it's the sort of scale that we need to drive
Mm,
accommodating the expertise and brilliance of so many emerging players in the sector, alongside that critical engagement with those companies that
yeah.
the MOD has named. The bandwidth isn't there. The structures and systems, we don't want to overly bureaucratize this, but
Yeah.
some form of engagement vehicles, this is going to continue to be disaggregated. And I think what I'm taking from this is that as the MOD builds its new structures, you mentioned, as new appointees come in to run different parts of the new machinery, we've all got to push ourselves, I think, to broaden the lens through which we're
Mm,
engaging and bringing these different innovators and problem owners together, more systematically. But we do need a system, I feel, that encompasses exactly the spirit of Red Queen on a much more sort of systematic and sort of routine basis.
yeah. And speaking of appointments, Hugo, some big ones recently. So walk us through
Yes.
some reactions to Gordon Brown. Any other appointments too that you've caught over the last month that are worth mentioning?
Well, exactly. And as we speak, the government is preparing for His Majesty the King's speech in Parliament. The Prime Minister is under serious pressure. But at the height of this latest rebellion, the Prime Minister, following the very poor results for the Labour Party in the local elections
Mhm.
last week on the 7th of May, appointed the former Prime Minister, Gordon Brown, as a senior advisor directly reporting to him on financial and economic policy in some regards. And what I took from this appointment was actually some very deliberate narrative around how it was that the Prime Minister would be looking to the former Prime Minister to advise on being some creativity around harnessing private finance into defence,
Mm,
as you covered earlier. And I think this is quite positive direction. We are going to have to see over the next days and weeks the exact constitution of this government, and indeed the leadership of it
mm,
is in question. That the government should be seeking to appoint somebody so senior and frankly respected in that community to
yeah.
help it drive at leveraging that private finance is another step in the journey that it is trying to take, as we
Mm,
discussed, not quickly enough
mm.
to really flood that private investment in. So I found that as a very interesting prospect. Let's see how long both the Prime Minister and this appointment last, but I think it does symbolise the need and recognition for this to be a mainstream policy agenda for defence under this Parliament.
I think too, what's really interesting is the people that are not moving. So not only the appointment of Gordon Brown, But interestingly, Minister Luke Pollard and Al Carnes and John Healey are not budging from their positions within this kind of political turmoil. And what I take away from that is that defense and being a minister associated with defense is not only a prestigious position that people do not want to give up, but also there is a security imperative not to have a lot of turmoil when it comes to defense. So I believe that those ministers understand the importance of funding defense and the defense investment plan. They understand the seriousness and the nature of the threat against us. Even though we don't see it in our everyday lives, I do believe we are under attack. And certainly Europe is rearming and we are really lagging behind. So for me, not only the importance of Gordon Brown, but also that we have 3 ministers who are refusing to budge. And I do note that in the past, people who have served as defense ministers for merely a month or so put that as the first ministerial posting on their resume because defense is so prestigious and people really aspire to it. And so what I hope is that level of prestige also matches how the government wants to not only lead on defense, but fund defense.
Yeah, 100%. And I think, you know, these defense ministers are certainly committed to that. We see the seriousness with which they're taking it. The frustration in the system, I think they might very well share in terms of the pace which we are going. And that does point to a difficult conversation between the Ministry of Defense and the Treasury, which we've discussed many times has been blocking and is at the root of the blockage for the publication of the Defence Investment Plan. And this was incidentally a line of, frankly, attack by Lord Robertson as to his rather scathing remarks towards the Treasury, the sort of the non-military experts in the Treasury, but also a direct reference to the Chancellor not really giving airtime to defence in both the budget and the autumn statements. So this is a bit of a divergence. I
Yeah.
think we are seeing that the seriousness of wanting to drive at it, and if the Prime Minister does survive this rebellion, there's going to be enormous pressure to get the Defence Investment Plan out with immediate effect. Obviously, the prospect of a leadership election, if that does take place, we're then it's going to be interesting to see how the government handles the release of that. But I share your, concern and a note of imperative for this to be enacted. So it is very interesting. We're going to have to see how the next days play out.
And then on the kind of a level or so down, more still on some strategic leadership, but I think more would argue operational is the retirement of Andy Start as the kind of interim NAD and now really fully over to Rupert Pearce, and then waiting for the announcement of the new Director General of UK Defence Innovation. So what are some other movements that you're seeing in terms of postings that we should be aware of?
Well, I think I reflect on Andy's retirement, and I think we've shared, and we saw him very briefly at the London Defence Conference, and he's decided to pursue the academic route at King's, no less. So pursuing his PhD in defence is quite an interesting move at a personal level. So watch this space for Andy Start. I think, as you indicate, the machinery of the NAD group as it's evolved, there's been a lot of movement in and around that. The 2 key positions I think we need to keep an eye out are one, which we're delicately not saying anything around the Director for Innovation, a 3-star appointment, and we understand that white smoke should be issued quite soon on that. I think the other one would be the note of the recruitment of Charlie Forte's successor in course around a 3-star appointment for the evolved role of Chief Information Officers. Both of those roles are going to be very important for our industry as docking points on the innovation side, but also with all the plans of digital technology and the reforms need to happen there. So those are going to be 2 of the big ones outside of course, what the cabinet looks like in sort of over the next week, days, potentially hours. So just space on that for the next update.
I actually
Also last month, of course, there's been quite a lot of getting out and about in the bazaars. And one of the things I noticed from your diary is that you were down in Shrivenham as the Defence Academy delivering a a module, I think, on innovation for, and I am checking the exact acronym here, the Advanced Defense Strategic Leaders Program, the so-called
No,
ADSLP.
I think it's actually the Army Senior Leadership Development Program, ASLDP.
Very good. So I totally fluffed that up. But in terms of your involvement, I mean, I'm fascinated because you're delivering a program on innovation to the leaders of the British
Yeah,
Army. Sort of
yeah,
what was the mood down there, and what did you take
yeah.
away from this year's module?
So this was really fun. I deliver this at their invitation very kindly a few times a year, and then when they've had enough, they'll ask me to stop. But it is an afternoon with 24 two-star either generals across the services or at the civil servant level representing the Serious Fraud Office, the National Crime Agency, the Home Office, fires and safety. So there's a really wide swathe of that two-star leadership across defense and national security. And I think the mood and my particular module really focuses on innovation. And I think really what the desire is to really get to the hub of what this actually means. And so 10 years on of starting kind of a quote unquote innovation journey within government, of really trying to grasp the nettle of this word means everything to everyone and therefore nothing to no one.
Mhm.
And so they're really trying to get to what does it mean? How innovative does the workforce need to be and entrepreneurial? And then how do we enable that to happen in order to achieve our own objectives? And now some of the anecdotes were really interesting in some of the smaller parts of government, moving very quickly, spending money in different ways, working very closely with tech companies in order to do that and really learn from them. And then in other bigger parts represented was a sense of inertia that they are trying to get over
Mhm.
and really kind of bound up into how to drive innovation and kind of move that ship by a few degrees. So overall, the cohort, very energetic, very bright, very forward thinking, wanting to do things differently, but not to a degree empowered as we would imagine some of them to be at that level. And then on the other hand, very surprising about how empowered and how much budget and authority some of them do have to make and affect change with which is what they're doing. But I think the power of that course is also again building those relationships at that level, pan government, being able to share ideas and really being able to kind of hold the walls open for some of these senior leaders whose calendars are just kind of pummeled every day for them to take some time to reflect and try to think about, are we in an innovative organization or are we in an innovation organization? What does that mean? And my part is a very small part in a much bigger program that they go through around this senior leadership development. And then the next day, I gave a lecture to the entirety of the Advanced Command and Staff course at the UK Defense Academy. They're heading into some research sprints over the summer. I gave them a primer on some methodology that they can use. And then I was followed by a woman talking, Rachel Braun Schoenfelder, co-founder of an agentic AI company, talking about how they can think about AI and trying to understand the interaction of AI. And what was very interesting is she and I gave this lecture last year. She asked the audience, how many of you are playing around with AI, kind of Claude, ChatGPT, Grok, Perplexity, whatever? And I would say maybe a third of the audience raised their hand. This year she went in and she asked the same question. Almost the entire audience raised their hand. So what we see is we see an entire cohort of officers who are now actively engaged with AI. But what's interesting is the gap of their engagement mainly happens outside of Copilot and more so in their personal lives because we don't yet have the sophistication of technology integrated across all of our systems. And what Rachel noted is some reports coming out, open source reports, saying there's a huge leakage of classified information because this frustration is spilling out now where people are moving much faster outside of the system than they're moving in the system because we haven't yet harnessed these tools. So those were the two engagements I did with the Defense Academy last week. Always really interesting, always a pleasure to go.
Fantastic. Great. That's really good. I love that. Now, the system in defense and security was very good, is it not? It's saying, well, hang on, you've broken the security. You're the one whose fault it is. Well, I do agree with that. If you're breaching sort of security classifications, okay, got it. However, there's also a responsibility for the system to empower the enablement of what is a widely adopted technology in everybody else's world. So we can't allow, frankly, the most important constituency in terms of the seriousness of what they are doing to be held back by that. So too often for me, that conversation becomes how sort of somebody's got it wrong for security classification, which obviously has to be part of this. I don't want to be belligerent for it. But there's got to be an emphasis on the center to empower the system to do that. And at the moment, our legacy IT systems have not been subjected to sufficient reform to enable that to happen.
Well, I think you raise a really good point, and that is when we think about kind of in our world customer development, which is you're building a product, and it's really whether the customer will use it and how they will use it. It's not whether you think it's a great product, and I think that there's a little bit of that missing, and that was really indicative of spending time with the entire cohort. So I think it's kind of 290 plus officers, both international, UK, tri-service. And so if you look at the level of engagement with Claude and Perplexity and OpenAI, is you have an entire workforce and a kind of officership who is now being native, and the next generation will be entirely AI native. And
Yeah.
so some implications, I think that there are both academic and practical. One is, well, if we can reform and overhaul the system where we really harness the power of AI, and we kind of quote unquote increase productivity, and we take a lot of the admin and the kind of mundane tasks and we free up some time, what does that new officer look like and what should they be capable of doing? And I think that is something, probably being addressed in academia. Certainly the Turing Institute is looking at that with a new study. How should we train defense and AI, and what are some of the implications? We have Professor Tony King out of Exeter who's writing a book on AI and the military. And so I think people are starting to grasp of, are we now going to produce a different type of officer? What does that look like? And then what always lags is, okay, then how should we educate them and change the apparatus by which we educate them? And so, coming away from that engagement with ACSC, certainly Rachel and I had that conversation, which is, okay, it's really good to think about the tactical of how do you train them to use things like Claude and Claude Cowork. But some of the bigger strategic thought is, what officers will this produce? And it's not just the integration of technology and these capabilities. Really, the jurisdiction of knowledge that our officers have and our soldiers is their jurisdiction of knowledge is warfare. There's kind of now no excuse for everyone to be the most competent and the smartest they can be because they're not bogged down with these mundane things anymore because we've used AI to do it. So how are we going to refactor the educational component in the armed forces? How are we going to produce officers who are more creative, more complex thinkers, more critical thinkers, and really steeped in operational design, warfare? I think that's a really interesting debate. And that was something I really took away from last week of being at the Defense Academy, of some of these bigger things I don't think we're yet building the infrastructure for.
Right.
We want to leave folks with a concrete action, both from a policy point of view and from a more tactical point of view of what they can do on the back of this month. So Hugo, over to you.
Thanks, Ali. Well, for me, the state visit, the ongoing narrative on UK-US cooperation is still live and well. It's not without its pressures. Politically, there's a lot of noise, but we've said that prospects for cooperation and therefore business remain strong. But in parallel to that, I think we are seeing from the UK government, of whichever form it takes in the coming weeks, leaning back into seeking to deepen defence cooperation with European partners at the political level, but also practically with efforts to try and reintegrate the UK into some of those efforts. And I think we're going to see more of that. So I think the takeaway for companies and others operating in this sector is, as we in some regards always done, you need to engage on both of those things. Both are important. Neither are going away. Tectonic plates may be shifting to a degree, but cooperation remains live. And in that context, there's a lot of opportunity to engage both with the US defense sector, but also across Europe.
Thanks, Hugo. I think for me is coming off the back of that engagement with the Defense Academy, one really kind of poignant thing that I think Rachel does really well is she asks everyone in the audience to raise their hand, all of these officers, of the last time that they've picked up the phone and called a tech company just to learn about a particular piece of technology. And, in each year, we've had maybe 3 or 4 people raise their hand. And she says very eloquently, call them. They're waiting for you. They are waiting for your call. to understand how they can help. I think that we'd be very naive to think that someone calling you up from defense and saying, how does technology work, is the beginning of a commercial conversation. The opportunity is, how do we actually increase the education and awareness to build these better relationships and therefore greater resiliency in relationships between industry and government, because it's not just commercial. So the opportunity that I take away from this month is for each industry and defense to pick up the phone and call each other and to learn about what you don't know. And through that learning, form better relationships, stronger relationships, increase trust between industry and defense, and then understand what are the possibilities that can come from that.
Brilliant.
Thanks,
Really
everyone, for
appreciate
joining us. We will see you again in a month.